everybody, Josh Sigurdson of World Alternative Media here, and of course we're joined by author and economic analyst here. I'm John Sneisen, and considering that Ontario is pushing through the $15 an hour minimum wage, starting in 2018 at $14 an hour, and then in 2019 at $15 an hour, I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about how incredibly stupid this is. And people are going to go, wait, you don't believe people should make a livable wage? First of all, a lot of people bring up the idea that a $15 minimum wage is going to stop big monopolies like McDonald's. That why can't McDonald's, as multi-billion-dollar company, pay this wage? It's not about that, folks. In fact, it works against your favor if that's what you think. When you raise the minimum wage by law, you not only just cause McDonald's to have to pay more, but you cause small businesses to have to pay more, which means the competition in the market among the smaller restaurants and restaurant chains, they're going to get wiped out because they can't afford to do this. They have to lay people off, they have to sell less product, they have to be open less amount of time, and then they eventually go under. And people keep talking about, well, people need to make more money. Of course people need to make more money. The problem is inflation. Yeah. The problem is debt that's perpetuated by the central banks and the regulations and the taxes. And when we see the $15 minimum wage go up, what's going to inevitably happen is you're going to cause the prices to go up. So that $15 will soon be equivalent to that $10 or so. And the same thing's happening in Alberta. It's going through in 2018. And I just think it's so important that we talk about the fundamental issues with raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So John, what do you think about this?
Well, first of all, as you said, you mentioned a whole bunch of array of issues that comes with raising the minimum wage. Now, there's so many issues with raising a minimum wage or having like a boundary on that wage that is a minimum. As Josh said, you know, it kills the competition for the small businesses to be able to enter the marketplace. They don't stand a chance, first of all. Mm-hmm. And then on top of we're not just talking about the minimum wage here, but there's other aspects as well as the inflation. There's higher taxation. You will actually bump up people into another tax bracket, and then suddenly that minimum wage wasn't worth anything really, and then prices goes up on top of that.
And then we have unemployment too, because these regulations and these taxes and raising the minimum wage pushes the rich people out of the market. I mean, I'm not talking about the mega rich. I'm talking about the well-off rich that actually end up being the employers that bring on the employees. Instead, they have to lay them off. And then, of course, it moves into things like technocracy, where we have machines selling burgers instead of people. And then there's more people laid off, which means more poverty. I don't understand why this is so difficult for so many people to understand.
Well, yeah, of course, these big businesses, they're looking at ways to save money, of course, and that's what they do. They just automate everything, and then they get rid of people. It's very simple. I talked about this. There was in the financial industry, there was a financial advisor that said, what are we going to do about this? Because I was talking about the management expense ratio, which is the fee that they charge you for your mutual funds or different types of funds that you invest in. And she was asking me, John, what do you see as a solution to this big problem of these high management expense ratios? Well, I said, well, just automate it. It's very simple. You get rid of all those fund managers and you pay like 0.1% instead of 3, 4, 5% sometimes.
And with the rise of technocracy, we're going to see a new form of slavery without the slaves. It's like the reason that slavery had so much incentive when slavery existed when it comes to employment in the 1800s and before, the reason why there's so much incentive to that was because they didn't have to pay people to work. They paid for some food and so on. They bought the slaves as a product or a machine, basically. Well, these new machines are not people. They don't have to be paid. They're bought one time, and the expenses are just keeping it up to date and keeping the hardware going. But in the end, they don't have to pay anyone. So of course people are going to go through that, especially if they're forced in that direction by these insane regulations. Because after all, the more you regulate, the more you create these state-run monopolies that people constantly on the left bash but don't understand how they're created. They think it's just capitalism and the bourgeois. They don't understand that the same things that they're doing, the appealing dialectic of problem reaction solution, which they implement, is what causes the problems in the first place. And it's just so frustrating to watch people go, we need to fight for 15, we need to fight for 15 with conveniently red and black flags, and in the end they're the ones that end up unemployed. And it's so often as well,
it's just a vicious cycle that they're creating for themselves.
Well, yeah, and a lot of these people's parents, because let's face it, a lot of these people that are pushing for this are more like the trust fund kids, and I've seen that on campuses. And it's interesting that it's almost like an attack on their parents. Their parents wouldn't be able to give them that trust fund. Their parents wouldn't be able to bring them up the way they have. Well, I mean, when it comes to money, not when it comes to the mind. Obviously, they didn't do a very good job on that. But it comes down to the fact that these people, these same kids that are calling for the $15 minimum wage, so many of them, I don't want to collectivize all of them and generalize, but so many of them would not be able to be as incredibly privileged as they are today if it weren't for a lesser amount of regulations. But as you pile up those regulations, the parents, the baby boomers especially, are going broke, which, by the way, they spend more money into the economy than anyone, but they're going broke, while kids are getting in insane amounts of debt and depending on their parents.
Yeah, well, the baby boomers, you got to remember, they rode that debt wave. Remember, we were talking about the debt wave that they've been riding like they did back in the year 1000 in China, for example. Of course, they rode that wave, and now they had a substantial amount of money. They were mortgaged up to their eyeballs, and suddenly there's no more money left to really borrow to, because their generation, a lot of, as you said, trust fund kids, they don't do anything. They're stuck in limbo because you have rising prices. Everything's costing more, forcing, especially the small businesses that could employ so much more people if you let the free market truly take over. They are getting stuck with having to fire people, and it's just a massive destruction. Then, of course, you have the huge piece that you touched upon, the inflation.
Well, yeah, the price of living constantly goes up at a higher rate than the wages. And as you raise those wages, the price of living goes up that much more. Of course, a big part of inflation comes from printing currency out of thin air, fiat currency. And it, by its very creation, it devalues, creating debt and inflation. And it just becomes a big debt bubble that continuously grows and grows and grows. And it's another problem reaction solution scenario. But then on top of that, there's the inflation that comes with just regulating the workforce, regulating the markets to the extent where they blow it into oblivion by raising prices.
Well, here's the problem. It's the belief that the government has to give you money all the time to do things and to help you get ahead of and not suffer. That's the problem. Like, the government is racking up so much debt because they have all these programs that they want to have, and they have all these regulations that are bringing up the inflation, that are destroying the value of the currency. And of course, on the other side, you have the Bank of Canada and others, like severely lowering their interest rates. So you have people just flooding into debt because it's so easy and cheap to get to, because they can't afford with their regular wage to buy things. And now you have them, of course, getting into mass amounts of debt, and it's a vicious cycle going forth and back. Yeah, you can raise the minimum wage up to 15, but then the problem is you're going to get right back to that point very fast again.
And then they're going to be like $30, and
Well, yeah, it's like in Venezuela, Josh.
Of course,
where they've been raising the minimum wage.
Yeah, it all looks very reminiscent compared to Venezuela, but I mean, so often people seem to forget the fact that, like, they talk about the monopolies that we see today, and rightly so. There's huge monopolies, but their way of fixing that creates more monopolies. Everything the government does, the free market does better. Every single case can account for this. So whenever the government steps in, they create a lack of demand and a lack of individual demand. They artificially manipulate the markets and create faulty demand for one or a few companies, state favorhood and monopolization and subsidization, and they create that to take off. Places like McDonald's, places like Walmart, stuff like that wouldn't exist if it weren't for government regulations that keep their competition at bay. If you get rid of those regulations, what you're going to see is real competition and innovation. People have to compete to keep their prices down. down, and they have to compete to be able to produce more. So yes, there are a lot of businesses that wouldn't pay well, but that money would go further because there'd be less inflation, obviously, and there'd be more demand on cheaper products in the market. So what you would see is eventually monopolies would start to die out into smaller monopolies that are just based on individual demand because they put out a product that's better. And there's also incentive because these businesses aren't as likely to treat their workers like crap, because if you have these kinds of if you leave it up to individual demand, a boycott would go much further because there'd always be that other guy to take its place and do better and innovate better. You can cure diseases, you can make everything cheaper, but the more that the government continues to manipulate and rig this market and rig the economy, the more that we continue to see it fall, and we see more poverty, and we see more rich kids talking about the rich, while poor kids are paying taxes up to their ears, and they're losing vast amounts of money. They're in poverty, they can't afford food, and so many of them don't understand why that is. I'm not saying there aren't poor people that are protesting in this, because obviously a lot of people have a profound misunderstanding about how the economy and the markets work. They don't even realize that markets and monetary are two different things. They can play into each other, but they're two separate entities. And when each is artificially manipulated, we see this continue to happen. It's Hegelian, and it just never ends. I mean, how long, John, have we been talking about this? How long have people individually been talking about this, been proven right again and again and again, only to be replaced by the same problem at almost on steroids?
Well, and then of course I'm looking at an article here that says, pour money into your pension or risk a poor old age, the IMF is telling all millennials around the world. Well, the problem is that all these promised government pensions, and of course government programs again, right? Is not sustainable. They are so unsustainable, and of course that's another way they also destroy these small businesses that they force them to actually have to like take a portion of their employee salaries and put it in as well, and they say, well, I'm just gonna, limit this one employee that will give me more money.
Yeah. Whatever happened to personal responsibility?
Yeah. I think that's the biggest problem we have here is there's no personal responsibility anymore. We always look at the government to fix things, and it's a huge flaw, and it's gonna bite us really bad in the ass, like very soon.
Oh, very soon.
Because the problem is you're gonna have all these government programs and everything, all these promises and regulations and everything. You're gonna end up like Venezuela, where there's massive starvation and violence and everything, and then they are massively regulated
and hyperinflated.
And they had 150 different certificates hanging at the back of shops,
and all these laws,
regulations.
Yeah, all these insane laws everywhere and regulations. And the thing is, inflation and regulation beget debt. We see so much debt rise out of this. It's a huge derivatives market. It's a huge debt market. It's all debt based, and what comes out of debt, as I often say so often to exhaust, is that it's kind of like being shoved down a bottomless pit of debt, and the only way up is to ask for a ladder from the government and the banking system, and then you, my friend, are in servitude. And that is exactly what they want. This is a massive complex. It's a control complex which uses people's emotions against them, because people's emotions get the better of them instead of looking at the logical side of this and actually calculating how this works. Because I've had enough arguments with people who believe in the minimum wage hike, and they just blow it off and say, oh, you're getting philosophical on me, every time I start explaining the basic logic of how this is actually a very bad idea. They just say, you're getting philosophical on me, get out of here.
Sense.
Yeah, what about
to do with philosophy.
And it sounds great, giving free things to people, but nothing's free, and you're taking that from someone else, and what you're causing is a greater amount of debt and inflation and regulation and government control, and eventually you end up on your knees begging for scraps of food from the government, and that's always how it ends. Maybe not right away, but it's always how it ends. And seeing this happen in Ontario and Alberta is heartbreaking, because Alberta is one of the backbones of Canada's economy, and we're going to watch so many small businesses in Alberta, once one of the greatest places in Canada for business.
A lot of it comes from royalties from the oil fields.
Yeah, and I prefer the government doesn't survive and we as individuals survive on the free market, because as I said, everything the government does, the free market does better. But when it comes down to this, I mean, it's going to really dramatically affect affect Alberta in 2018. It's really going to dramatically affect Ontario in 2018, 2019. And it's going to continuously come down on people's shoulders as everything gets heavier. People are stuck holding it up, and eventually it's too heavy and it collapses down on top of them. And Ontario is going to see the stress of this over the next few years. We're going to see a lot of small businesses get crushed under these heavy regulations, and we're going to see a lot of big businesses benefit from this, because those are always the ones that are lobbying for these kinds of decisions. We see a lot of big, massive industries lobbying for these kinds of decisions, and it's funny how the banking system and the oil companies are always involved, yet the Liberals and the leftists say, well, we got to stop these big companies. Meanwhile, they're the ones largely behind these ideas, because they're hand in hand with the government, and they get their monopolies from state regulation and subsidization and favorhood.
Yeah, well, that's the big problem here, is you see this massive monopolization that we're moving towards with all these regulations that the government is putting into place.
Yeah.
And well, look just here in Manitoba, where we have all these crown corporations that have all these benefits from the government, right? To look at how badly run they are, and look at how
expensive they are.
How expensive they are, yeah. Yeah. I said, like, when we were starting up the Manitoba Party, we said that we were going to open up for all crown corporations up to competition, but we would let them actually compete because they claim that they have the cheapest prices.
It's sad that you have to say let them, you know? It shouldn't even be part of the equation that you let them. People should just do what they want as long as they're not aggressing against others, and then bring the benefit forward to the individuals, those that are in poverty, those that are taxed to death, those that are regulated to death, to rise up and be able to compete and innovate and do what they love and be able to earn the money necessary to actually have a sustainable, good life instead of being crushed under this weight.
Yeah, well, it all comes down to, we also got to look at the monetary system, right? We're completely screwed with the monetary system, and that's the reason why we're trying to like raise these minimum wages and everything. Well, what's going to happen is you're going to see what happened in Germany and other places during the hyperinflation. They just constantly raise incomes for people every year, you know, a certain amount of percentage, and then you're just going to have like a perpetual time until people see like, well, this currency is becoming completely worthless, and then you're going to have that massive flood and complete collapse of the whole monetary system, which all these like minimum wage, minimum income, all these welfare programs that the government, the breads and circuses that we call them here at WAM, they're just back to the old days of the Roman Empire, when the government gets too big, it's just gotta, you know, entertain you and give you money. Yeah,
and eventually you'll see Nero playing his fiddle as Rome burns, and that's always the end result of these kinds of horrible manipulations and basic enslavement under the guise of helping and giving a hand up, which is just insane. But I think we got to basically the bottom of it today, and I really do urge people to look into just the basic economics of this. It's really simple to dissect and understand if you just look into the basic economics, but instead too many people are triggered by emotion rather than logic, and that begets enslavement, because as it always has, people are so prone to feel emotions and not understand the basics of something and just go through a gut instinct for that particular idea. Because people watch the news, they go through public schooling, and they don't learn about these things. They just hear things that sound good, you know, free this, free that, and they fall for it. And it's unfortunate, because I know a lot of good people that believe in this, and it's just out of a complete misunderstanding and misdiagnosis of a very simple monetary and market principle understanding. It's just a very simple concept.
Well, it's like Walmart, for example. Walmart is basically, because they have such low minimum wage, like the minimum wage, what they do is they rely on the government to pay those, I think it's almost 50% of their employees is on food stamps in the United States, for example. So it just shows you how these big corporations love this minimum wage, and how they just say like, well, I'm just gonna have the government give me money, and then I could just give them way lower wage. So meanwhile, while of course their competitor is struggling.
And that's always the way it is. Just push the small guy out of the market and monopolize the big corporations in favor of the government. And the government, people often say, well, the corporations own the government. No, the corporations depend on the government. The government owns the corporations. That's a problem. That's a huge misunderstanding. Corporations are made powerful by the government.
Yeah, they work together.
Yeah.
That's the problem when you have a government, is that it's always going to be misused.
Yeah, free market demand wouldn't allow this to happen. And look, this goes back to the 1860s with the patent office, monopolizing an idea so no one else can compete and come out use that same idea and make it better and innovate. That's always the way it's been. And as the monetary systems got worse, as the markets got more manipulated, we continue to see this unraveling at a bigger scale.
More extreme, right?
Absolutely. It's hugely extreme. It's going to come down on us eventually. And this is why we need to speak up against things like this, even though it's unpopular to do. Because so many people, you go onto some of the college campuses and start talking like we've been talking, and you'll get lynched, you know? Yeah, they'll throw firebombs at you. So, I mean, this is where we're at, and we need to start speaking more loudly and speak out against these punks that are violently attacking anyone with a different ideology, and then speak out against these, big government philosophers that push this point of view, these academics that push this point of view and push us into oblivion and push us into debt.
Well, a lot of these, what they gotta have to learn is like look past a 50-year time frame.
Yeah.
Because usually that's what they do, 50 to 100 years. That's the most that they would ever look back. They don't look at all the historical events from the 1600s, 1500s, maybe even back to the Roman Egyptian era.
They think it's different. They think it's different, but it's not different. It's just mathematics and
human nature, and that's the way it's gonna happen no matter what.
If it's on a bigger scale or not, you look down to those percentages, not to the exact number. Over history, it's no different, and it's going to continue to happen as long as we don't, learn from history. But anyway, thanks, John, for going into this with me, and we'll be back to you with much more. Check the links below. GoFundMe, Patreon. We can't do it without you. Any donation is very much appreciated, especially as we are so vastly demonetized and censored by YouTube. Also, check our Bitcoin address in the description and the comments, as well as on the screen for you to scan if you please. And also check our link to the Red Pill Expo, which takes place June 23rd to 24th in Bozeman, Montana, where you could see people like Robert Kiyosaki, G. Edward Griffin, Lord Monckton, Jeff Berwick, James Corbett, Cynthia McKinney, Richard Gage, Mike Adams, Ty Bollinger, Joel Salatin, John Rappaport, and the list goes on and on and on. It's going to be an incredible event, and we hope to see you there. But until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson and John Sneisen signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.
Bye.